Okay, in this video we're going to look at some of the skirmishes that occurred during the medieval period that helped shape British history. Now, medieval Britain is often remembered for its grand wars and legendary battles, everything from the Norman Conquest right through to the War of Roses. Yet in between these were massive conflicts, were quite a lot of smaller skirmishes and local feuds that shaped the course of history, especially in Great Britain. And they tended to influencing power, dynamics, territories and alliances. Now these skirmishes often went unrecorded or were mentioned only briefly in the chronicles, yet they were pretty vital to medieval society, with families, local leaders and minor lords all jockeying for power. Now in this video we're going to highlight some of the lesser known but quite fascinating smaller skirmishes that took place across medieval Britain and explore some of the causes, impacts and legacy of those skirmishes. Now the first we're going to look at is the Battle of Argoed Llanffaine in around 630 AD. Now the Battle of Argoed Llanffaine was a small but notable skirmish between the Britons of the Kingdom of Gwynedd and the invading forces of the Angles from Bernica, which is basically present-day modern-day northern England. Although little is known about this exact location or the major details of the skirmish, it is mentioned in the Welsh triads, medieval poetry, as an instance of quite fierce resistance against the encroaching Saxon kingdoms. During this time, Britain was divided into a variety of small kingdoms, with many of the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms were expanding steadily into what were traditionally Brittonic lands, and this brought them into frequent conflict with the remaining sort of Brittonic rulers of Wales and Cornwall. Now, this particular skirmish, though was quite minor compared to some of the larger scale battles of the period, it is remembered as a symbol of Welsh resistance and determination to maintain cultural identity in the face of Anglo-Saxon expansion. Now, the battle inspired later poetry that kept the story alive, ensuring that the Welsh pride and spirit of independence would be remembered. Now the next one we're going to look at is a Battle of Carnham in 1018. Now the Battle of Carnham was fought near the River Tweed between the forces of Scotland under King Malcolm II and the forces of Northumbria, which were led by Earl Uhtred, although it may be considered minor compared to many of the more famous clashes of the period. The outcome of this skirmish reshaped the Anglo-Scottish border for quite a number of centuries. Now, the English were struggling with internal conflicts at this period, especially following Viking invasions, and Scotland took the opportunity to reclaim land in the region. The Scots emerged victorious, and the skirmish led to the border of Scotland shifting south to the River Tweed at this time, and establishing what would eventually become a more permanent Anglo-Scottish border. Now it's a critical moment in British history, as it shaped the long-standing territorial lines between Scotland and England. Now the third battle we're going to look at is the Battle of Burton Bridge in 1322, and this was during the reign of Edward II. England was divided at the time by political strife. Now the Battle of Burton Bridge was a pretty small yet significant skirmish, and it was fought in March of 1322 between the forces of Edward II and the rebellious Baron Thomas, Earl of Lancaster. Now, Lancaster had been an early supporter of Edward II, but grew disillusioned with his king, especially regarding Edward's reliance on his unpopular favourites, in particular Hugh Despenser the Younger. Now, Lancaster gathered his forces in opposition to Edward, hoping to oust him. Now, the royal forces outmaneuvered Lancaster's army and forced them into retreat. And this small skirmish was a turning point in the rebellion, leading to the eventual capture and execution of Lancaster. His death pretty much symbolised the dangers faced by the noble dissenters under Edward II, and highlighted the fractured society of English politics at that time. Now, the fourth one we're going to look at, is the Battle of Cadzo. I think that's how I pronounce it correctly. It was in 1336. Now, the Battle of Cadzo was a pretty minor skirmish, and it was fought near present-day Hamilton in Scotland, and was one of the several conflicts during the War of Scottish Independence. Now, the Scottish forces were led by Sir Andrew Moray, and they clashed with an English garrison stationed at Cadzo near Hamilton. Edward III had renewed efforts to consolidate and control over Scotland, and in response, the Scottish nobles and knights loyal to the cause of Scottish independence resisted in a variety of skirmishes across the Scottish lands. Now, the Scots achieved a minor victory here as they forced the English garrison to withdraw, though temporarily. Although not a major military engagement, the skirmish Cadzo symbolised the resilience of the Scottish fighters, who continued to challenge English incursions even in the face of daunting odds. And small victories like this fueled morale and helped sustain Scotland's resistance over the many years against English rule. Now, our next one we're going to look at is the rout of Ludford Bridge in 1459. This was quite a pivotal moment in the War of the Roses, marking an early clash between the House of York and the House of Lancaster. It took place near Ludlow in Shropshire, and this skirmish involved far fewer troops than the main battles, but it had a quite significant repercussions. The Yorkists, led by the Richard, Duke of York, were marching south when they encountered Lancastrian forces near Ludlow. Now, they were outnumbered. The Yorkists initially intended to fight, but were betrayed by a portion of their forces, who defected to the Lancastrians. The Yorkist leaders were forced to flee, leaving their army to be disbanded by Lancastrians. And this loss was quite crucial because it led to the exile of some key Yorkist leaders, including the future King Edward. Now, despite the setback, the Yorkists would return stronger and more determined, ultimately leading to their dominance in the War of the Roses. Now, battle number 6 is the Battle of St Albans, which is the first battle in 1455. Now, this is a relatively small engagement and is often overlooked, but it was the first skirmish in the War of the Roses and set the stage for future conflicts between York and Lancaster. Now, tensions had been simmering between the Lancastrian king Henry and Richard, Duke of York, when the Duke's forces confronted the royal army in the streets of St Albans. Now, the battle began, marking the official start of the War of the Roses. Though this was pretty small in scale, the battle in Albans resulted in the capture of King Henry by the Yorkist forces. This skirmish signalled a breakdown in order and the start of decades of warfare between the two rival houses, which would eventually reshape English society and nobility. Now, number 7 is the Battle of Glen Truil in 1307. Now, this is really quite a lesser-known episode from the Scottish Wars of Independence. The Battle of Glen Truil saw Scottish forces under Robert the Bruce clash with English forces in a rugged area near Loch Truil. Now, Bruce was in hiding and was using guerrilla tactics at this point to harass the English army and was avoiding a direct confrontation with a much larger English force. At Glen Truil, Bruce ambushed the English forces, who were pretty unprepared for the rough terrain. Even though this is a minor clash, the skirmish was a massive morale booster for Bruce and his followers. It showcased the sort of effectiveness of guerrilla tactics. It also cemented Bruce's reputation as a resilient leader who could leverage the Scottish terrain to his advantage. Now, these smaller battles and skirmishes are often sort of overshadowed by the much larger conflicts, sieges and medieval British history. Yet these engagements paved for crucial roles in the broader tapestry of history, affecting regional power balances and inspiring future resistance and marked turning points in long-term conflicts. In many cases, they allowed influential figures such as Robert the Bruce or the Duke of York to build their reputations and demonstrate tactical skill. Moreover, the smaller skirmishes reflected the everyday struggles of people and lesser nobles whose lives were intertwined with these localized feuds and minor conflicts. A lot of these smaller engagements bring us a lot closer to understanding the realities of medieval life and the complexities of feudal Britain. We all know a lot of the big set-piece battles, but they generally were few and far between. It's a lot of these little smaller engagements that were more frequent, from sort of early right through to late medieval period. The majority of the battles or clashes were smaller in scale, but we kind of only know a lot more detail about the bigger battles like Agincourt, Towton and stuff like that. But most of the time, most clashes were a lot smaller, a lot more localized. They were a local baron kicking up over some reason or other, or they were peasant uprisings and stuff like that. And I find these are more interesting ones to sort of play out as a wargamer, especially if you're doing a campaign that's a lot more localized. Things like, I years ago did a local campaign in around Derbyshire and South Yorkshire during this English Civil War, following the leading John Gell and his antics and shenanigans in that sort of conflict. And you could do the same in during one of the medieval ones. And it promotes looking up your local history and things like that, and finding out what skirmishes, what small engagements happened during that particular period in your local area. But it also means that you can then find out about a lot more about your local area and some of the historical sites and locations around where you actually live. And it just gives you a bit more of an overview of where you live and the history of the places are surrounding you. And I think oftentimes we overlook the local history. Looking at smaller skirmishes and engagements gets us to know what was going on where we live during that period. Anyway, that's all for this week. I'm not going to rabbit on any longer. Don't forget to like and subscribe, and I'll see you next time. Cheers.